Perfect. Well, thank you guys again for having me. I am really excited to be here. Um, Today, if you weren't at the last one, that's okay. I think you'll still really find this session valuable, but feel free to go, like they said, back onto YouTube and you can watch the first part of this. Um, my talk from last month or 2 months ago, I believe, and that will hopefully provide some maybe a little more context if you didn't watch it. But today, essentially, I wanted to kind of work on kind of we sort of talk theoretically about component testing at Cypress, and today I kind of wanted to sort of show it in an applicable way. Again, I'm Jordan Powell. I'm a developer experience engineer at Cypress, and as also a Google developer expert in Angular. So today I'm going to kind of show a real life example. I'm going to be doing a lot of live coding. So hopefully this is not too fast. So, like I said, this will be recorded. So if there's any parts that you missed, um, uh, you can always go back later and rewatch it, but feel free to stop me or ask questions and along the way, and I'll try to answer those. But essentially, what I wanted to do is kind of show a real life example of, say we have a form like this, and I wanted to basically use this as an example of how you could use component testing to, as a developer, to sort of refactor or basically build out a feature. So what I want to do is basically take this form here and I want to convert it to a React component, actually multiple React components, and we're going to use Cypress Component Testing along the way to kind of help us out with that. So one of the things that I want to do is first, we'll go and we'll create an actual component. Let's copy everything here. Let's create we'll call this a login form component. And let's go ahead. Hopefully you guys can see what I'm typing. Hopefully that's big enough. So we're going to create a login form that basically, oops, I need to return this. Hopefully you guys know React. If not, the concept should still make sense. You probably have you've already recognized we're going to have to change all these classes to class names. So we'll replace these. We'll save this, and we essentially now have a React component. It doesn't really do anything. It's just basically our HTML that would get rendered in React. But what I want to do now is let's actually start to use this in Cypress. And we can launch Cypress by, it's already installed. If you didn't already install it, we just yarn add Cypress or npm install Cypress. And then you can launch it by calling npx Cypress open. Again, I kind of went into these details in the last talk, but yeah, this is basically what will launch when you start Cypress. And in this case, we want to configure our application to use Cypress. Cypress identifies and picks up that we're using React in Vite, and it's going to go ahead and tell us we have all the dependencies installed we need, as well as show a list of all the files that Cypress is scaffolding. And we're going to go ahead and launch it here in Electron. And okay, so we have Cypress running, but we're not doing anything. But what we're going to do now is we're going to use this feature in Cypress called create from component. And what this does in React is it will identify all the React components that we have, and it will automatically create a test for us. So we're going to find this login form we just created, and we're going to create a file, and let's run it. Okay, so we now see our component, but it doesn't look very pretty, and there's several reasons for this. One is we need to copy our styles that were in this asset folder here into our application. So what I'm going to do is inside of our app.css file that our app component is using, I'm just going to paste all of these styles here, and we can refresh this, and you'll notice still nothing is actually displaying in our component. Well, there's a couple reasons for this. Well, the main reason is this. So if we go to the Cypress folder that Cypress created for us, Cypress has a folder inside of it called support. And when we're using component testing, it generates really 3 files, but we're going to talk about 2 of them today. The component.ts file is one we're going to look into. And what we're going to do here is basically this is a file that gets preloaded basically before every single test is run. So what we want to do in this case is we want to import that style sheet before every single test. Now we rerun this and look, voila, our form looks much, much better. And so again, hopefully this sort of, we're going to use Cypress like this to sort of TDD this process. And I'll show you kind of some best practices along the way. And so that's kind of the workflow I'm going to take today. Hopefully, hopefully that makes sense and that I'm not going super, super fast, but there's a lot I want to show you in a short amount of time. So again, here we have this form, but there's a couple other things that you'll notice that we're missing. These fonts look a little weird, and that's because inside of our actual assets here, we realize like we're actually loading some fonts from Google that get put into the head of our application. The problem is like, how would you actually go about doing this with component testing? And the other thing that this is a great opportunity to sort of demonstrate the other thing that gets scaffolded inside of this support file, which is this component-index.html file. And essentially what we can do here is this looks like just like an index file. And what happens is the Cypress loads basically for every test, it will load this file for component testing. And so like anything we put in the head will then work. So then we can paste in those fonts here or any other static assets. Maybe it's like style sheets from a CDN or something like that. And then basically the component gets bound to this data root is sort of technically what happens. So if we then, let's go ahead and show this here. I'm going to save it and move back real quick. And you'll notice now these fonts look different and better. So again, just a recap, inside of this component-index file, you can paste custom assets that you have that you want to get rendered on every single component. And then if there are like parts of your application, like style sheets and things like that, you can import them as part of this component support file as well. So that's a couple of getting started things that we have going on here. But let's really look back at our login form. And there's a couple things. One, I'm going to delete this because we're not going to have time to get to this, but it's a React component, but it doesn't really do anything React-y. There isn't anything dynamic. There isn't really anything meaningful about this component. So there's a couple parts we can notice. We have a label, which is basically this block of code that's essentially has a label, it has an input, and it has some validations. So we have this actually twice in here. So this is a good candidate for a component that we can create. We also have a button and some validations. So a good place to always start, I feel like, is, or I should say when learning component testing, is buttons. So let's go ahead and create a button component as a good starting point. So what we can do here is let's go ahead. Hopefully all this typing isn't super, super boring. Let's create a button and let's return this here. Voila. And again, nothing changed because we actually haven't done anything to this button. But if we were to change this to be button from here and import this button, you'll notice we're getting an error, and that's because we're passing in children in here. And so one of the things, we need to make this component like an actual button. So we can make this a functional component, and we can basically pass in, or basically this button is essentially a React button. So what we can do is we can make this a I think it's button HTML attributes and HTML button element, I think. Yes. So here, and now we can actually pass in our children as a prop. And then here we can do this. And now we can save this. And now we get it. Everything looks the same, right? But it's really hard to see this in a meaningful way. So let's actually go back to Cypress here and let's actually create a test for that button. So let's create from component. Again, we'll click button and let's go ahead and create a test. Now you'll see here, it's a button with nothing in it because we're not passing any children to it. So if we wanted to, we can this is what I like to do with Cypress is when I'm building these out, I'll like to put tests on one side and the code on the other, and it's a great way to sort of build these out pretty I don't know, in a pretty easy way. So what we can do is we would need to write a test that says something like it uses custom text for the button label. So that way when we pass like a child or something to render inside of the button that it passes it on. So how we write these tests, again, is side up button, and then we just pass in the JSX that we want to render. And let's just say, we want to say, click me, something like this. And we could save this and you'll now see we have two mounts, the one that has nothing in it, and then now our new one, which has click me in it. So we probably also want to do some validation that validates that the button actually has the text in it. So we're going to get a button and then we're going to write an assertion that says it should contain text, not HTML, but text called click me. Now we can save this and our test passes, which is good. The next thing we would want to do is, so we know we can pass things, labels to our button, but we need to also validate that when we click our button that an event gets emitted, right? Because that's something that's important. So when the button is clicked, the on-click handler should be called. Oops. And we're going to mount this and our button, hello world. And the way we do this is we could just pass in a prop, but the way you can check for like a callback function or something like this is you can actually pass something in Cypress called a spy. So you could do, it's just you do side.spy, and then what you can do is you can assign it an alias, and you can alias this spy, or essentially a way to say, hey, I want to call this thing later or reference this later, and you can do .as, and then you can give it any name that you want. So we're going to call it the on-click spy. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get a button, we're going to click it, and then we can then use side.get, and we can reference this by basically pasting it in, but prefixing it with an @ sign. So anytime you see an @ symbol like this in Cypress, it's basically our way of identifying that this is an alias. And then we can do a validation that says this should have been called. So we can now save this and our test is failing. That's because we haven't actually, if we look at our button, there's no way for the button to attach to the on click. So what we could do is we could, because we made this a type of button element, we could reference on click here, but maybe there's other things that we want to reference. So what we can actually do is just spread the props here and then pass them here. And as simple as this, our test now passed. So again, this is what I really love about component testing is you can sort of TDD features like this, where you can understand, okay, this is what this button should do, this is what this feature should do, and then use it to sort of validate that your tests are working. So again, we have a button, and that's kind of pretty trivial, but let's look at something a little bit more interesting, right? We have this login form, and we now have a button on it, but we have these right here, these like inputs, right? So one of the things that we need to do is let's create a component for this. So let's create something called, and we'll call it an input field. And again, we're going to just copy everything inside this label, the input and the validations for this thing. So we're going to export const input field. And hopefully this isn't boring everyone, me just typing, but hopefully this you'll sort of see the value in this, and along the way I'll show you I'm showing some tricks. So we can go ahead and save this, and let's go ahead again, and you guessed it, we're going to create a new component. We now pick up our input field. We're going to create that component, and voila, we now have an input field, which is pretty cool. But we're going to need to make some modifications to this input field. So one of the things that you'll notice is this is an actual input. So we're going to need the sort of React things for this. So one of those being the actual like native input stuff. So we're going to call input HTML attributes and HTML input elements. And again, yes, Danny, I know it's React is very, very simple to write. Yeah. So again, we're gonna grab all the props because there's lots of things we're gonna pull from this, and we're going to bind this to and spread these out here like we did before. But the other thing you'll notice is we also have this label, which is sort of static, and we have these validations, which are static, which we need to also pass properties for that. So let's go ahead and also add some additional props, and we're going to call this a label of string, and we'll call this required message of string. And we'll pass these in here, and then inside of here, we'll add label required message. We'll save this. And now actually our test will fail because we are not actually passing in the props that we need now. So we know that we need to pass at least a label. In this case, we'll call it username, and we'll call required message, and we'll say username is required. Something, whoops, it's required message. There we go. TypeScript to the win. So here, if we save this, we now get this. We now see this is saying username. We can call this what we could call it first name if we wanted to, and you'll see that change. Again, this changes so fast, like before I can even get to Cypress, it's already saved or reran. So this is an example. We have sort of this basic thing run, but there's also another couple things we're going to have to do to our component. You'll notice here is we have this username that's sort of statically put here, as well as this invalid state, which is basically telling the component when it becomes invalid, because this component doesn't really have context of other things. So we're going to have to first, let's take the name attribute from the component, and we'll pass this here. So one thing we can do is we can do this. So instead of passing username, we could do props.name. We'll do the same sort of thing here. And error / this. So now we're passing these name props. So if we then pass in name here, everything still works the same. But like I said, we don't know when, we don't want to show these required messages. We could just show them anytime there's nothing in the field, but we wouldn't really know when the user's trying to submit the form. So what we really need is we need one more attribute on our one more property called submitted. And we'll make this a Boolean value. We'll pass it in here. And then what we'll do is instead of setting this aria invalid to false statically, we'll press this to submitted. So we could set this to submitted, but what we really want to do is we want it to say when the form is trying to be submitted and the value of this input is invalid. There's nothing in there. We would want to show this. So we need to pass one more prop into this, and we're going to call it submitted equals, we'll say false. So now, again, everything works as expected. Let's go ahead and write a test for this case because we really need a test that says that we should show an error if the field is blank and the form has been submitted. Okay, we want to, so at this point, you're going to notice we're going to have to copy in a bunch more props again. So one of the things that I like that we can do is we can we could create constants here. So we could basically pass these things, create variables, constant variables for these. And then this is a way for things that are mostly consistent. We can then pass these names like this, label, required message, so on and so forth. And then you could just copy these all over. And in this case, we want what the form has been submitted. So we want to say submitted equals true. And let's see. So you'll see that this is here, but we don't have our message, which we need to look into. Why are we not getting our message? So let's see. Props.name error message. Let's see. Are we not getting? Oops. Here, let's see. What is it saying? It's saying, or what we could do is actually we need to. We can. What we would need to do is we want to get this thing, and we want to basically say we want to get it and say like the error slash username like should contain text required message, something like this, which it's saying this, but we know that that's not right, but it's because we still missed something, and I have to figure this out. What's going on? Is required. Let's see. It's not visible, but the reason why I think is I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'm missing something. But you will get the idea here of sort of how we kind of go through this process. But I will mention one more thing. So one of the other things that we're going to do a lot of is you're going to end up reaching for a lot of the same type of selectors, getting certain elements from the DOM. And when you're just doing a single like a single component where maybe there's only one validation message like this or something like that, generally it's not that big of a deal to only have that. But what we can do is we can do something. I what It wasn't displaying because I was didn't save this file. That's exactly why it didn't work. Um, but what I was saying is we're gonna be calling like a different. We're gonna have to get the validations for these, and the selector is dynamic based upon the properties you pass it. So getting this is going to be a bit cumbersome over time. And so one of the things that we can do is we can actually go back to this components file and we could do something. One of my favorite things about Cypress is we can create custom commands for whatever we want to run. So in this case, let's create a command called get error message for. We're going to this is actually just going to be this is where you sort of this adds the typing for TypeScript for these things. We're going to assign it to the type of a function we're getting ready to create. We're going to pass in the label that we're going to use, and we're going to create a function. We then we need to implement this function, but we first need to tell Cypress to add a command for get let's see, get message error message for, and then we're going to say when you call this function, and whatever we implement in this function, it will call. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to just copy pasted some code for this. But the point is this is now I can replace this and I can say sci.get error message for, and I'm going to pass in the label that I'm using. I'm going to save this and everything still works as expected. So this makes it a little more readable, a little bit easier to write. I'm not passing in magic strings and some weird concatenation. Yeah, so what exactly good question, Danny. So basically what's happening is anything in this components file is going to get run before every single Cypress test. So what we can do is basically Cypress allows you a way to extend on top of it to create your own sort of implementation details. So in this case, we have an error message for we want to get an error message for a specific label that we pass it. And so we could run this on any single test inside of Cypress and it would work. And in the same case, we're going to probably want something similar that's like get input for, and this is going to be the same type of sort of deal we just did. We're going to say it's this. We're going to pass in the label and we're going to implement it. We're going to create cypress.commands.add, and we're going to assign it to this function that we need to implement. And let me just pull some code for this. We'll go ahead and return this. And so now, like if we wanted to, let's just say we wanted to type in this value. We could do something like side get input for the label, and we could type ABC123. So now if we go back here, you'll see ABC123 was typed in, and we didn't have to pass anything more specific than just our label. The reason now when you're just in this component, it's not that big of a deal because there's only one input. So I could just say get input. So it's not really that much I guess simpler, but what really comes in valuable is if we go back to say our login form and we need to implement these input forms, or the input fields we just created. So if we wanted to, we could add these, and we're going to give it a name of username, a label of username. The required message is here. Required message of here. We also need a submitted value, which this needs to be like an actual dynamic thing. So what we can do is we can use React. We'll use like set use state, and we'll just pass this value into this. And so now we created an input field here. We could do the same sort of thing for the password. We're going to say password is required. This is password. This is password. And again, we're going to pass the same submitted prop down. And so now this login form is starting to look a little bit more realistic, right? It looks the same, but the actual I guess code itself looks more Reacty, right? It looks more what you would expect to see inside of a React component. So we could start, but again, you could see how if we were to write a test for this login form, these helper methods that we created become that much more valuable, because let me open this over here. So say we want to test, it says we want to make sure that our login form has a username and password input. So now we mount our login form. And the great part about this is we don't have to pass any props or anything into this. It just works out of the box. So then now all we have to do is get an input for, and just say username. And we could say get input for password. And you could say should be visible, something like this. You login form. And so here, again, we're now running these tests, but this would be much harder because this component has multiple inputs. So creating a helper method that made these easy to reach for makes it more valuable the more tests you write and the different levels that you write the tests. So hopefully that makes some sense, right? So another thing that you might notice is we have we need to validate that our inputs working, but we don't really have them wired together at the parent level. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to write a test that says like that the fields should show individual validation messages if they are blank and the form has been submitted. Something like this. We need to mount the login form. We need to get the button that contains login inside the text. Again, we could create a custom method to do this as well if we wanted to. We're going to click the button, and we then want to make sure that the error message for username should be visible, and that the same for the password should be visible. Now, our test is going to freak out right now. And the reason why is, don't worry, it's actually for a couple reasons. And mostly because when we click this form, we need to do a couple things. We need to add a handler to handle the form when it gets called. And so let's create a handle submit, but function that's going to be an event of a form event. And then what we want to do is say we need to prevent default. So that way now when we call this, it doesn't freak out, right? It's not continually trying to call this field, but you'll notice that these individual inputs are not actually called, and that's because we need to do some additional work here. And how we go about doing that is you'll notice that we're not really we are not really we're not telling we're never changing, we're never calling set submitted to be true. So basically when someone tries to uh, submit the form, we need to set submitted to true. And now you'll see these values appear, which is, and our test is passing. So pretty cool. Again, just like walk through. I think I can maybe do one or two more examples quick before we run out of time, and I want to make sure I leave some time for questions. But we also would want to do a case where like we want to make sure we do not show the validation messages if the inputs have a value and the form is submitted. So kind of like the inverse of this, like we want to make sure that if the inputs have value, that they don't show those messages. So we're going to mount login form. We are going to get the input for, again, this is really easy because we created that helper function. We don't have to think, how do I get this input? It's just like super easy. We're going to type whatever, test user, it doesn't really matter. Input for our password, we're going to type test password, and we're going to get our button that contains login in the side of it, and we're going to click it. And we want to then do the same sort of thing we were doing with getting our error messages, but instead of checking that they're visible, we want to say they should not be visible because that's the case we're checking. Let's do this, use it with password, and let's save this and see what we get. You'll notice now, even though we have a value here, these messages are still populating, and that's because we need to make a change to our form because we're not really keeping track of the values and value changes of our actual inputs themselves. So what we can do is we need to create a couple more pieces of state called, say, for username, we're going to set them to empty strings, and one for password. Again, empty strings. Then what we need to do is we need to pass in the value of username here, password, and then we also need to grab a hold of the onChange event. And what we can do is anytime the input changes, we want to call set username with the target value, and the same thing here. Set password. So now we'll see these are getting populated. It's updating state, and our test is passing. Voila. That's again another great example. The last thing I want to really do is I want to call this will show another sort of best practice that we should do. And this is, again, now that we're sort of handling this, we need to handle, we're handling these individual states of these inputs, but we need to handle this case, like every single time we're getting bad username and password. So we need to wire this in, right? So one thing that we are going to need to do is we'll start by creating the test. We'll call it, it should, let's see, it should show invalid username and password message when credentials are invalid, something like that. So right now, this is actually showing all the time. And so one of the things we want to do is let's create another piece of state, um, error message, and set error message and set it to an empty string. And what we want to do is we want to put the error message, bind it in here, and we want to only show it if we have an error message. So now if we call save, you'll notice that the error message is not there. So if we try to now mount this login form and validate this scenario, we would want to get our input for, we would want to type in username or get our username input, and let's say type bad username, something like this. Same thing for password. Bad password. And we're gonna get our button. Contains label. Click it. And we want to validate that we don't get this the message. I think it was whatever we can set to bad username or password. Should be visible. But now this is failing because we're never setting this message, right? And so what we want to do is after we try to submit our form, we want to first clear our error messages. So if we already had one, we want to clear it. And then we need to do some additional checking. So like if we have a username and a password, we want to we actually want to log in or something. So let's say we'll create a new function called username and password. And let's call login, which is going to be an async function, and we're going to pass it a username string and password string. I know I'm running out of time. I'm going to copy some of this to make it super quick. Going to use fetch to basically say, I'm going to call some auth endpoint. I'm going to make a post request. I'm going to pass the username and password to it. And let's just set some like condition that says like, if the response that status is equal to 401 or something, then we want to set the error message to bad username or password, the thing that we're checking for. So in assuming that we get an invalid case of this, we would throw this. Now the problem is that we're not getting this right. We're not running into this scenario. So we need to figure out why that is the case. So it is really for several reasons. Let's see. Oh, sorry, I typed in this wrong. I was gonna say that wasn't the error I was expecting. And so now you see it tries to actually makes a HTTP request, but it's getting a 404 because it's not found. So what we can do in our test is we can use something in Cypress called CIDA-intercept. And what it does is it actually lives in a proxy layer, and it actually, you can intercept like HTTP requests. So we're going to intercept a post request to our auth endpoint. And then what we can do is we can say, hey, I want to return a status code of 401. And so now if I press save, this now passes. And that's because you could see now we are getting a 401, and we can see this in our routes. It's saying, hey, you called a post request with auth, and basically you stubbed the results of this because we didn't care if we actually made a request or anything like that. We're just returning the results. So went super fast. Again, we're not gonna have time to go through a 200 case, something like that. But the last thing I really want to kind of sort of highlight is more here, where you can really go in and customize this. So whether it be Angular or React, something like this, like for React, the way mount works is actually this side up mount is actually just calling this extension point here, and then it's calling a function that gets exposed by Cypress itself. So we built these custom mount functions, but you can sort of extend on top of it. So one of the things you will most likely do is inside of React is you would in a lot of cases have you might have like say let's just say like maybe you would have a context, so maybe you have like a user context or something like that, and then you would want to wrap your you would want to wrap the component in, or maybe you had like a route or something, and you would wrap that inside of the that would be like inside of the user context, or probably on top of it. But you get what my point is. So this is a way you can feel free to customize your mount. So like a lot of times you'll be in a component where you have to do a lot of have to provide a lot of higher level parent like context and things like that. So just so it has all the context that it needs to mount the component. But you're more than welcome to go in and update these mount functions to actually do just what you want them to. And that's the beauty of them. Or you could create a custom user mount that then uses that user context. And you could, instead of calling side at mount, you would say side at user mount. So again, this is just super fast crash course on how you can sort of run into all these, how you can do these scenarios. But again, the nice thing is we built out a feature really within like 30-ish minutes. We have all the cases of our button sort of highlighted, documented, and tested. We have the individual functionality of our input, our user input field, and we could add some additional tests here. And then we have this login form that sort of connects all the dots, and you're able to test those, how the parts sort of integrate together in a way that's really useful as well. The tests are really fast, really easy to write, I think. And yeah, that's again sort of a deeper dive into how you can kind of run how you can leverage component testing to not only write tests, but really to TDD building your applications, building features or refactoring things. So that's one of the things I use it for the most, that I really enjoy. I find it's really easy to create the scenario or the use case in your application that you're trying to actually replicate. That's much easier than sometimes an end-to-end test, or even building it out and refreshing it and serving it locally, something like that. So do we have any questions? I know we got about 5 minutes left. I know I went a little bit longer than I did last time. But wanted to kind of show you as many sort of best practices you could. One of the things while we're waiting is one of the things I actually made a mistake on is I had typed in this login button thing wrong. So one of the things we could do is sort of avoid this in the future by we could create our own function called like get form button or something like this, and we could call it get form something like this. And again, we could create our own form that that is a label, and we could set the default to something like login, so that way we wouldn't continue to do what I just did where I typed in the wrong thing that contains the label. And so now we could go back to here, and we could just call side at get form button, that click, and what did I do wrong? Oh, again, this is a good example of I didn't add this command, even though I implemented how to do it. You need to go and uh, it's the add this, call this. Can you, Danny says, can we register interceptors also for common tests, similar to extends methods? Yeah, so you could create you could create you could create really anything inside of here that you wanted to. Um, and now our test passed, and I didn't have to mess up the whole clicking thing. I could refactor any of these to just use this, makes it easier, a little bit even more readable in some cases. But yeah, you could register intercepts if you wanted to. Um, but I would be careful with the intercept because anything in this file is going to run before every single test. So if there was a scenario where you didn't want to run it, it would be very you would find yourself like, why is this intercepting this when I don't want it to? So pretty much just know that anything in here essentially is getting like evaluated beforehand. So yeah, but yeah, you could create a function that say intercepts some calls and handles certain scenarios, something like that. So yeah, any other questions? Let's see. I don't see anything in the Q&A. I know I went super fast, guys. I apologize, but uh, the best way to kind of show this, I feel like, is to actually just write code for it. Um, so hopefully that's helpful. Perfect.